This conference will now be recorded.
All right. Anyone, any questions, guys, before I get started? Anyone, any questions that I can take before we get started? So this is the area that we're looking at. So we have a repository called iOS application, and then we have a branch called develop branch. And then whenever a developer is trying to, let's say, commit to this particular branch, he's using a pull request from a feature branch. So he has a feature branch, he's created a feature branch. He's doing a pull request, and on top of this particular branch, we have branch policies. Like we at least require one reviewer to go ahead and approve the change. We require the comments should be resolved. The work item should be linked. And also the merge type here, I'm only telling it's a squash merge that is allowed out here as such. After that, then we saw how to configure a continuous integration pipeline by using multiple steps inside the pipeline like .NET Restore, .NET Build, .NET Publish, then publish the build artifacts out here. And then we looked into something called as a self-hosted agent. And how do you basically configure, create, and use something called as self-hosted agents inside your pipelines, which will internally go ahead and generate the artifacts. And now in today's lecture, we'll try to see how can you use these artifacts. I mean, I have the artifact with me. It's a build product. Now I want to take this artifact and start deploying this particular artifact into a cloud called Azure. Into a cloud called Azure Cloud out here using another service called as a release pipeline service out here, called as a release pipeline, or we can call this as a continuous delivery pipeline or continuous deployment pipeline. In short, CD. So CI and then CD. So this is continuous integration and this is continuous deployment, which will bring us something like CD. And I am now trying to deploy the code onto the Azure portal. So I have the Azure portal with me and I'm now trying to deliver this code to Azure portal. And inside the Azure portal, I have a subscription. And let's say inside this particular subscription, I have an app service and an app service plan. So I create an app service and an app service plan, and I want to push my code on top of this particular app service and the app service plan out here. So I have multiple things out here. So let's look at this. So I have an app service which is running under the app service plan. So the code that I built, right? I generated the artifact out of this particular code. So it's all in a low level language. It's all ready to be deployed. I want to now use this particular service in order to push the code into the Azure portal. And into the Azure portal, I want to push the code into the app service, which is running under the app service plan out here as such. So now we are looking at two different services, guys. If I have to do this, right, there are two different services that I'm looking at. One being the Azure DevOps, the other being the Azure portal. Now, Azure DevOps is a software as a service. Azure portal is also a software as a service. So I'll put DevOps here and I'll put the Azure portal here as such. So my question is that if Azure DevOps want to make changes onto the Azure portal, because now Azure DevOps is trying to, let's say, go into a web application and try to change the features of the web application or try to push the code into the web application. So Azure DevOps is trying to make some changes onto the Azure portal. So my question, guys, is that does Azure DevOps or should Azure DevOps log into the Azure portal firstly before it should make changes? Yes, no, maybe. Anyone online? Should it log in? Yes, guys, any inputs here? Guys online, I need some inputs.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, it should log in. So let's say that, see, you are a user. You are able to log into the Azure portal. As a user, I'm able to log into the Azure portal. Now, my question is that as a user, if you want to make changes into your Azure portal or into the subscription of your, let's say, into one of your Azure subscription, what exactly would you need? What would you need to do this? Let's say you want to, you have your friend, you want to add your friend into your Azure portal and give him the access to your Azure subscription. What all would you do here? What all do you think would you do here, guys? Add the user under the subscription. How do we add the user under the subscription? What do we do exactly? What is that exactly called? When we say we need to add a user under the subscription, what exactly do we need to do here? I have a user called xyz@gmail.com. I want that user to be a part of my Azure subscription. What all do I need to do, guys? Invite user, okay. Anyone else? Guys, I need some answers here. I cannot proceed further without this. I have to stop the class if you're not really responding back.
We will give access as contributor.
As a contributor. So what is that exactly called? What is the technical terminology for the same thing?
Role-based access management.
Yes, role-based access
IAS.
control. Yes, RBAC, role-based access control, or IAM, or IAM. So did we do RBACs? Yes, that's what I was asking. Then why is everyone so silent
Yes.
here? Yes, we did RBACs, right? So we did RBACs, and we said there is something like owner, contributor, and a reader role. So very firstly, what I did is that I added a user called XYZ into my Azure Active Directory. So into my Azure Active Directory, we first went into the directory. We said Active Directory into the Azure portal. We went into users. We added a user. I'm not sure how many people have practiced this out, but we added a user. And then once the user was added, I went ahead into the subscription and we gave something called as a role assignment. So we added something called as a role assignment out here. So these are the two things that we did for a user, so that this user will have his own login ID, own password, and then he can go ahead and, let's say, log into the Azure portal and log into the Azure subscription out here. Good enough. But Azure DevOps, right? It's not like a regular user. Azure DevOps cannot use his login ID and password out here as such. Azure DevOps is not a regular user. Azure, let's say DevOps is a software as a service application. This is an application. So in order to make sure that two different applications are connected, there are a couple of things that we need to do in order to establish this particular connection. And we call this connection as a service connection in Azure DevOps. We call this as a service connection in Azure DevOps. Where do I find that? If I go into my dev.azure.com, let me go there. I'll say dev.azure.com, and let's open up our project, which is called sample learning. And in here, I need to get into something called as project settings. And once I go into project settings, I'll just scroll down. There is something called what? Service connections. It is telling service connections helps you manage, protect, and requires authentication to external services. And if I say create a service connection, there is something called as an Azure Resource Manager. You just go here, just say next. Please select service principal manual. So next. Then it's asking, okay, fine, Azure Cloud. The scope is subscription level. Then it's asking things like what is the subscription ID? What is the subscription name? Very importantly, what is something called as a service principal ID? And then the service principal key. These are a couple of things that I have already. Subscription ID, subscription name I have. Where can I get the subscription ID from, guys? In Azure, let's say here, if I go here, I have something called what? The subscription ID and then the subscription name. This is something that I have. But I don't have the service principal ID and the service principal key. This can be called as service principal, or you can call this as an app registration. So in order to get the service principal ID and the service principal key, we will have to create something called as an app registration in the Azure portal. We have to create this. How do you create it? Let's see. Let's go back into our Azure portal. Let's go back into our Azure Active Directory. Now, instead of going for users, I will just scroll down. There is something called as what? App registrations out here right now. I'll click here. I'll say new registration. And I'll say something like sample learning, DevOps, something like this. I'll just scroll down. I'll say register. That's it. This is what I do in order to create something called as an app registration. This is also called as a service principal, app registration or a service principal, which has an ID called what? Application ID or client ID with the ID called what? Something like this, 0FF, something like that. So I will copy this. Go to my Azure DevOps, paste it here. So I'm copying this, I'm going here and pasting here. And then you have what? Key. It's telling service principal ID and service principal key. Now I did not create a key for it. I'll just scroll down. Here you have something called what? Secrets and certificates. So I'll go here and I'll say new client secret. I'll say something like DevOps secret or something like this. Say for 6 months, I'll say add this out and I'll copy the value that I get here. So I'm copying the value. I'll go back. I'll paste my service principal key once again. So I copied the ID, I copied the key. Just scroll down and it's asking for what? Tenant ID. And where will we get the tenant ID, guys? Where can we get the tenant ID?
Azure Active Directory.
Active Directory.
Azure Active Directory, exactly. So if I go back into Azure Active Directory, I have something called what? a tenant ID. I'll copy this out, come back here. Is a tenant ID out here. I'll give a name to the service connection. So it's saying just give a name. I'll say sample connection. Let's see. Yeah. So we have to fill up these fields also, subscription ID and subscription name. So I'll just go back. I'll just copy this out. Call subscription ID. Sorry, subscription ID and the name to the subscription is Visual Studio Enterprise subscription. I'll copy this out here as such. So once this is done, what I'm doing right now is that now I am representing Azure DevOps as an app registration. So what I did is I created an app registration on the Azure portal. I went ahead and I created something called as, or I took something called as a service principal ID, and then the service principal key, tenant ID, and finally one last thing that I'll do is that once coming back at my subscription, I'll go into identity and access management. I'll say add a role assignment. Just like I added a user the last time, I'll put a contributor here. I'll say next. Just like I added a user here, I can also add something called as what? Service principal into my Azure Active Directory. So what I'll do is I will just go here and just select members and I will look for that particular service principal called sample. I have something called what? Sample learning DevOps. I'll take this, I'll say select, I'll say review and assign, and I'll say review and assign. So now I created something called as an app registration or a service principal. I created a secret for that particular service principal. I'm using all those credentials in Azure DevOps, and I have also assigned something called as a role-based access control to that particular service principal out here. This is something that you have to do in order to establish this connection between the Azure DevOps and the Azure portal. So on the DevOps side, I'm creating something called as service connection, and on the Azure side, I'm creating something called as an app registration, or also called as what? What do we call this as?
Service principal.
Service principal. Service principal with something called a service principal ID with service principal name and all these things. So this is what we have. And once that's done, I'll say verify. Verification is successful. I'll say grant access to all the pipelines. I'll say verify and save. This is how I created something called as a service connection in Azure DevOps, which has the authority to now talk to the Azure portal. This is the Azure portal connection. This is what it has the authority. This particular service connection right now has the authority to talk to the Azure portal, to communicate with the Azure portal out here as such. This is what it can do. This is what it will do. Now, let's see this. I'll go back into my project. Sorry, I'll go back into my project. Okay, wrong project once again. And once going to the project, till now we have created something called as what? A build pipeline. And this build pipeline has given what to us, guys? What did this build pipeline produce? What did it produce?
Artifacts.
Artifacts. Now what I'll do is I'll go to something called as release pipeline, and I do not have a release pipeline. I'll say new release pipeline. I'll just say empty job. I'll start with something called empty job, and I'll say this is a .NET release pipeline, .NET application release. And these are the components of a release pipeline. This is the name of a release pipeline. Here it is telling what is the source artifact. It's asking me, where is your artifact? Please give me your artifact and tell me what are the stages you want to deploy to. this can be something like development stage. Then you can have something like QA stage. Then you can have something like production stage and so on and so forth. Which means a build pipeline, a release pipeline has two different things. One is a source artifact. The other is the stages where you want to deploy this out to. These two together will give you something called as a release pipeline. So I'll start with the artifacts. I'll say add the artifact, and it's telling where is your artifact? Is your artifact inside a build pipeline? Is it inside Azure repository? Is it GitHub? Is it TFEC? Is it Azure artifacts? Is it GitHub release? Is it Azure container? Is it Docker Hub? Is it Jenkins? Where is your source artifact? And what should we select here, guys? Where is our artifact? Build. Exactly. It's in a build pipeline. And where is the build pipeline? Which project? This particular project called sample learning. And then it's asking me what is the source build. I have this one called source build, and I will say add. So I'm adding my artifacts from, let's say, the build pipeline out here. Then it's telling what is the name of the stage. We can call this as a stage or an environment. Like environment can be development environment, QA environment, staging environment, production environment, so on and so forth. So what I'll do is I'll first click here. I'll say this is a development. So the very first stage, I'll say this is a development environment. And here I have something called jobs. It's telling, okay, fine, you know what, in your development environment, you have something called agent job. If I click here, it's asking me what is the agent. Again, I can either go for a self-hosted agent or a hosted agent out here. Any one thing. Since I deleted our agent, right? That's the reason I'm going for a hosted agent today. I'll use the Windows latest. So I built my artifact, and I'm also using the similar agent to go ahead and release my artifact in order to maintain the configuration between build and release. And here what I want to do is that I want to add a task. And what I want to do here is that I want to push my artifacts into the Azure portal into a service called Azure Web App. So just go here, say Azure App Service. Just type this. Here you have something called App Service Manage. You have something called App Service Deploy, App Service Settings, and etc. Here you have something called App Service Deploy, meaning it's telling, okay, fine, if you want to take a code and deploy into the app service, this task is going to help us. I'll say add. It's telling great, App Service Deploy. And now it's telling, okay, fine, what is the name of the task? I'll say App Service Deploy only. I'll scroll down. Here you have something called as what? Connection type, meaning it's telling where do you want to deploy this out to. I'll tell the connection type here is Azure Resource Manager only. Just scroll down, it's asking me for what? The Azure subscription. Just click on this. Here you have what? Available Azure connections, and here I have what? Sample connection. I'll just click here. I'll say sample connection. Then it is telling me, okay, fine. Where do you want to deploy it on? Is it a web app on Windows? Is it Linux? Is it function app? What do you want to really do that? I'll say it's a web app on Windows. And here it is asking me for the app service name. Just click here. It's telling no results found. Reason being, I don't have any app services in my Azure portal. So if I go into Azure App Services, I don't have any Azure App Service at all out here as such. I'll say create an app service firstly onto my Azure portal. I'll say new resource group. I'll say this is DevOps RG, something like this. Demo app service. DevOps .azure websites.net, some app service out here name. I'll say this is .NET Core 3.1. I'll say this is EastUS2. I'll take some random plan. You can also change it to, let's say, F1. It's okay. Even if you put this as F1, I'm good with that. As I deployment networking, I'll disable all these things out. Monitoring also I'll disable, and I'll review and create it out here as such. So since I do not have any platform to deploy, it's asking me, okay, fine, I'm not finding anything. Please create a platform. So I'm now creating the platform, or I'm now creating the infrastructure to push my code. So I'm creating the infrastructure to go ahead and let's say push the code out here. So let's wait for a minute for the entire, let's say, platform to be created. And once it's created, we can go ahead and do a demo of our release pipeline, and we can see how an end-to-end process really works. Like as a developer, I'll raise a feature request that will kick off a continuous integration pipeline that will give you the artifacts, and as and when the artifacts is available, it should kick off something called as a continuous deployment pipeline, which should deploy the code into Azure, into the Azure portal out here. So an end-to-end flow is what we'll try to kind of see. So let's wait for a minute for the app service plan and the app service to be, let's say, created. And once these are created, let's go ahead and first trigger our first release and see how it looks like, and then from there we'll go ahead and let's say trigger the second release and so on and so forth. Is anyone any questions still here? Anyone any questions that I can take till here? So if I go into the resource group, I have the app service plan, and inside the app service plan I have the applications that is running, and I have one simple application called DevOps service. And if I go here and if I say browse, it's going to give me the default page of the app service. This is the default HTML page of the app service out here. I'll say, okay, great, not a problem. Just come back. And I'm now going into the Azure DevOps portal. I'll just refresh the screen here. Now I have what? The demo app service getting visible. I'll say, okay, take this app service. It's asking for the package or folder. It's telling me where is your zip file. Give me your zip file, meaning the zip file is nothing but your artifact. That's the artifact that you produced. I click on these three buttons and I'll say this is the iOS application.zip. This is what I have, and done. I'll say save, and I'll say first release pipeline. Say okay. Now I'll just go ahead and say in the top right corner there is something called create release. I'll say create release into something called development stage. I'll say create. It's telling release 1 has been created. So it's telling release 1 has been created. So if I click on the pipeline, there is one release that it got created, which is now doing the same thing. It's trying to, let's say, get the agent. It's understanding what is the kind of agent that I need. Is it a hosted agent or is it a self-hosted agent? It's initializing the job. So it's telling, okay, fine, I'll get the agent for you. I'll download all the required softwares on the agent. Then all your artifacts are here right in the build pipeline. The next step here it's doing is that it's going ahead downloading all the artifacts on top of the agent. And finally, we have something called as an Azure App Service deployment that is happening right now, wherein it's taking all the code, it's going into the Azure App Service. All it's doing is that in your local machine, when you do a build and then you do a publish, right? Here it's just doing an automatic publish without having a human intervention out here. So it's saying, okay, fine, I'm doing a publishment and it's taking all the code and it's trying to, let's say, target that particular code on top of that particular platform out here as such. So let's wait for a minute and see how this changes our application, what happens to our application, and so on and so forth. So it's telling running package successfully deployed the application. Let's wait for a second. It will take a minute to verify whether the code is properly running or not. And once it confirms, we'll go ahead into our Azure portal and we'll browse the application and we'll see what kind of a code is deployed out here as such. So it's telling successfully updated the connection and done. So it took less than, or it took, let's say, around 1 minute out here. I'll go back into my Azure App Service. I'll say browse. Let's wait for a minute and let's see what kind of a code we have. So it's telling iOS application, home, privacy, welcome page, and it's telling, okay, fine, this is the CI demo and so on and so forth. Same code, same changes what I have edited in my let's say repository out here as such. So yes, Anyone, any questions till here? Anyone, any questions that I can take till here? Are we good, guys? Is everyone able to follow this? Any questions that I can take? Okay, let's see. I have a couple of questions in the chat. Okay, sir, users, what did we add in Azure DevOps are the same in Azure? Okay, fine. Firstly, where exactly can we create the user either in Azure or the Azure DevOps? Now, that question I have answered. Firstly, in Azure, I have told you how can you create a user. That was the very first class that we did. In Azure DevOps, we did cover it in the earlier session on how do you, let's say, go and add a user out there. And where can you get an option in the release pipeline to make a continuous deployment? That's something that we look at as to where can we get an option in the continuous deployment pipeline or in the release pipeline to make it as a continuous deployment. But the first question has been answered. We did that earlier also on, let's say, in the Azure Active Directory, how do you add a user? In the organization settings of Azure DevOps, how do we add a user? There's something that has already been covered. So please take a look at that particular session. And now let's do one thing. Let's edit this pipeline. I'll say edit. Here, I want to now add something called as a continuous deployment. This is not a continuous deployment pipeline. It's just a simple release pipeline. Here, if I come down to my pipeline, on top of the artifact section, I have a flash icon, right? There's a flash icon. It's like a power icon right now. So what I'll do is I'll just click on this particular flash icon and I'll say, it's asking me what? Continuous deployment trigger. I'll say enable. That's it. I'll say save. Say continuous deployment trigger enabled. And here you will have a tick mark if you enable it. Just below the flash icon, you have what? A tick mark out here telling that you know what? Continuous deployment is enabled. If it's not there, if continuous deployment trigger is disabled, you don't find the tick mark there. That's how you'll identify whether continuous deployment is enabled or not. Now let's see, let's go into our build pipeline. One change that I'll do in my build pipeline is that I do not have the self-hosted agent today. So I'll just change my agent pool from, let's say, 7 a.m. pool to Azure pipelines. And I'll put this at, let's say, Windows latest. I'll save this. I'll say this is changed agent pool from self-hosted to hosted. This is what I'll say. I'll say save. And now let's see. Let's see the end-to-end flow and how this happens. Now develop is my main branch. This is the branch where all my changes are going in. And I, as a developer, will firstly create a feature branch. The feature, something like my name, the CI/CD test, and I'll associate a work item with the same thing. Because if I don't associate the work item out here, the branch policy will not be satisfied. And if the branch policy will not be satisfied, I cannot do a merge. I'll say create. I'll go here into, let's say, something like pages. Into the index page, I'll go here. I'll say edit. I'll just edit my entire paragraph here. I'll say this is a CI/CD demo using Azure DevOps. Instead of welcome, I'll put something like Azure DevOps demo. Something like this. I'm just changing the page. I'll say commit. Say updated the code. I'll take the work item. I'll say commit. And once committed, I'll create a pull request. As a developer, I'll go and create a pull request into the feature, into the develop branch. And I'll say create. And as and when I created it, there are a couple of checks that I had to approve. One being work item must be linked, comments must be resolved. Then I have someone called as contributor must approve this change. Even this is enforced by the branch policy. In your branch policy, we have something called as an automatic approver or automatic reviewer. This is where we went ahead added something called as a contributor here. And if I log into Azure portal as a contributor or into DevOps portal as a contributor out here, so I'll say sign into Azure DevOps account. I'll log in using that particular account called RBSC contributor. At the gmail.com, let me do that. Once I log in, so this is now your technical lead who's coming here and trying to review your changes. So going into this project, I'll have pull requests. This is updated the code. I can check this out. I have, let's say, all the branch policies in place. I'll say approve. As and when the reviewer approves this out, the pull request at my end, which is using this account called classes Azure DevOps, is also updated. I'll say complete. I'll delete the branch after the merge is done. As and when the pull request is merged, what is going to happen, guys? What will happen after the pull request is merged? Guys, what's going to happen after the pull request is merged?
Pipeline gets triggered.
Pipeline will trigger exactly. Which pipeline is getting
Build
triggered?
pipeline. Build
It's a
pipeline.
build or a continuous integration pipeline that's getting triggered, which will go ahead simply build your entire code using all these things, telling that okay, fine, it's going and trying to download the .NET, it's trying to restore the code, build, publish, and let's say publish the artifacts. This is what is happening on a continuous integration pipeline. So this is where we are. Our code got, let's say, merged into the develop branch, which is now going ahead and triggering a continuous integration pipeline. Continuous integration pipeline right now, which will produce the artifacts. This is what it does. So let's wait for a second for the continuous integration pipeline to complete. So if I come here, it will take like a minute or so to install this particular tool. And once it's installing the tool and once it's going ahead and doing a restore, build, and publish, at the end, like in a minute or two, like we should give it like about 2 or 3 minutes. After that time, it will go ahead and give me something called as the artifact. As and when I have the artifact, it will trigger the continuous deployment pipeline because the pipeline has something called as a continuous deployment trigger. So let's wait for the build to complete and let's come back in a minute in order to check this out. So yes, any questions guys till here?
In pipeline, restore, build, and publish. What does a restore do, sir?
I'm sorry, can you come again please? I did not get the question.
Restore, build, and publish in pipeline. So, what does restore
Restore.
do?
What does restore do? Okay, you can stay on mute. Thank you. What does really restore do out here? .NET restore is a step that is essential for the build to happen. Restoration here is called restoring the software dependencies that are required by the code. Again, purely a development terminology. Purely as a developer, you have to go inside restore, understand what restore really does. But as of now, you can just understand that without restore, you cannot have a build. The build will fail without the restore out here as such. That's the reason we add a .NET restore task out here as such. Now, just a second, I'll come around to your question once again. Artifact is published. And if I go into the release pipeline, I have a new release pipeline that got triggered 742. This is something that I did not trigger. It's a continuous deployment trigger that happened. And as and when the continuous deployment trigger happened, it took less than it took less than a minute. Went ahead, updated the code. And if I now come down here into the code, I'll just say refresh my screen. Now all my changes are now coming here. Called Azure DevOps demo. This is a CI/CD and so on and so forth out here as such. So as and when the build pipeline got triggered, there are steps in the build pipeline, and one question was that what does restore do? Restore just goes ahead and downloads all the software dependencies that is required by your code. This is an essential step before you go ahead and let's say build the code. So you have a restore, you have a build, you have a publish. Finally, you have the artifacts. We are taking the artifacts right now into the CD pipeline or the continuous deployment pipeline, and then using the service connection that is established between Azure DevOps and the Azure portal, we are going ahead and deploying the code out here as such. Guys, again, I am observing a lot of people are not practicing this out. If you do not do this, you'll simply be out of sync with the class. You won't be able to understand what we are trying to let's say, what I am trying to let's say tell, or what you are trying to let's say understand. Until and unless you do not practice it, you won't have questions, and if you do not have questions, it'll be very difficult for you after the course is finished to again ask questions, come back and ask questions out there. Please make sure that you are revising on a daily basis, and that's the reason I am telling this flow every day. This is very, very, very important, and I'm observing a lot of people are not even being regular to the class, or even if you are being regular, you're not really following. So this will not really benefit you at all. Yes, any questions here, guys, on the entire workflow that we are following right now? And Priyanka, does that answer your question on what is .NET Restart?
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Good. Pavani, your voice is too low. I'm sorry. Your voice is too low. I'm not able to really follow. Just give me a second. Yes, can you please go ahead now with your question? Yes, you can do the same thing. I mean, the question here is that can I use the same agent that I used to in the build pipeline? As of now, if you look at my agents, right, that agent will be offline because I deleted that particular agent. I deleted that agent. I deleted that machine from the Azure portal. But if you want to do that, very simple. Firstly, if you want to make sure that the same agent is doing the build and also the release, firstly go into your build pipeline, change this agent to agent pool, something like this. Save this out. Go into the release pipeline, say edit, and in the release pipeline, just come here to the tasks, agent job. Just change the agent job into something called a 7am pool. That's it. So now you can use the same pool and the same agents inside the same pool in order to both the build and release out your search. Was this your question, and does that answer the question? Can you create multiple agents in single virtual machine? Yes, you can create any number of agents in a single virtual machine. Agent is nothing but a service that is running on your virtual machine. So you can have multiple services that are running on the same machine out here. You just have to repeat the entire process of agent creation. Just name your agent. In the first place, I name my agent as agent 01. The second time, just go ahead and name the agent as agent 02. Should be good enough to create multiple agents on a single machine out here as such. Not really. It is not a best practice really, because if I end up doing that, if I need 10 agents, I'll have to create 10 different virtual machines, which means that I need to pay that 8 rupees into 10 times per hour, which is 80 rupees per hour. So we do not really follow that particular practice. We normally create a high powered machine and we go ahead and let's say create multiple agents on the same machine out here. It will work. It should work. No problem at all. You can create multiple agents in a single agent pool. Yes, you can do that. Mhm. So if you select the yes, if you have multiple agents, Azure DevOps based on the algorithm will go ahead into your pool, see which agent is available. It'll first check which agent is available. Secondly, it'll check which agent ran your build pipeline successfully for the last time. And based upon these two factors, it will go ahead and select the agent out here. So the agent selection is automatic. You do not have to really do anything out here as such. A simple save in queue is nothing but when you save, when you do something, make some changes, right? Say I'll make some changes out here. Let's say I put my agent in a different way. Firstly, I have to save this. If I save my changes, the pipeline won't really trigger. I can just save it out. But if you want to save in queue, you're saving the changes at the same time. You're also telling Azure DevOps that please go ahead and trigger this pipeline off. Both commands in one way. Queue is nothing but now queue is grayed out because firstly you'll have to save your changes, and once you save the changes out, then your queue option will come into picture. So instead of doing a save and then queue, if you want to save and queue out here, you can just click on save and queue, and this will go ahead save your changes and also queue your builds out here as such. Yes, any more questions, guys? Can you share us any sample ASP.NET file so that we can practice a pipeline? Definitely, yes. I can share a sample ASP.NET pipeline. Sorry, ASP.NET file. So let me go ahead and give you a sample ASP.NET file out here. So this is a sample ASP.NET file. You can take this out. You can download it. You can save it inside your repository, and you can go ahead and build your pipelines out here as such. Yes, this is the sample file I can send across. So you can go ahead take this particular link. I have the entire .NET application built here, and in the coming classes I'll also go ahead and give you how do you build a database, how do you do a database deployment, and so on and so forth out here as such. And I'll also share that file for the same thing out here as such. You see more questions, guys? No problem. And also, can you demonstrate us using with Python file? No, Python is something that is not the area of expertise that I do have, but I can help you telling how do you build a pipeline for an application like Python or Java or something like that. I can tell you, I can show you how to, let's say, how do you do it by, I mean, how do you do it your own self? How do you, let's say, build those pipelines out here as such? All right, any more questions, guys? Any more questions that I can take here?
So once I get virtual machine, every 5 minutes it is getting disconnected.
So once you create a virtual machine, so when you say disconnected, what do you really mean by it? Is the machine getting, let's say, into a stop state, or when you're logging into the machine, you're getting logged off?
Now once I connect this RDP,
Mm-hmm.
well, creating PowerShell,
Mm-hmm.
suddenly it is getting disconnected. So from yesterday.
I have to check that out. Just restart your machine once and see whether the same issue occurs again.
Sure, okay.
Yes, any more questions, guys? All right. So before coming to the session tomorrow, I want you all to go into and understand how do you create an ARM template for a web app. Create an ARM template for Azure App Service. This is what I want you all to have a look at, because I'm not going to again explain the basics of ARM template. We have already done ARM templates out here. So we would take an ARM template and we would understand. Today we said how do you deploy the code on infrastructure. In tomorrow's session, we will understand how do you create the infrastructure and then deploy the code using Azure DevOps. I am not going to, or we are not going to, let's say, follow the practice of creating the infrastructure manually. We would have to look into automating the infrastructure out here. So I would say please go through the basics of ARM template on what an ARM template really is, and then before you come down to tomorrow's session, please look at what ARM templates are, so on and so forth. And we will go ahead and look at how do you create an infrastructure using Azure DevOps and ARM template, which is called infrastructure as a code. That's the main concept that we are going to cover out tomorrow as such. Yes, any questions, guys, before I close? Anyone, any questions that I can take before I close? Mhm. Agent as an interactive, I do not really take that. It's a very, very rare case scenario for agent as an interactive out here. Please follow the documentation for the same. Try to create agent as an interactive in Azure DevOps. Please take a look at the documentation firstly and see how do you go ahead and create the agent as an interactive out here. I'm just going to Windows Agent and just scroll down. You have the steps on how to create agent as an interactive service. Just go there. Please create the agent as interactive, and also you have the documentation for interactive versus service out here. Interactive is a very, very, very less used, let's say, use case scenario out here, only when you need this particular service to run something called as UI and interactive testing. This is the only case scenario where we go ahead and configure the agent as interactive. Now I want you all to tell me, how do you configure it? I've configured the agent as a service. I showed you how to configure as a service. There is one simple step. The entire thing is the same. One simple step where it's going to ask you, do you want to run the agent as service? Just say no, and that will just configure the agent as an interactive service. That will just configure the agent as interactive out here for you. That's the only difference between agent as interactive and agent as a service out here as such. So please look at that. Try to configure the agent as an interactive, agent into an interactive mode, and let me know if you're able to do that. If you're not able to, please let me know. I'll help you in the same. I'll help you with the same thing out here as such. Yes, any more questions, guys? Again, you have to practice this, guys, on a daily basis. You have to go through the documentation. If you're not doing that, you are not taking the benefit of this particular course. It cannot be like after the course is completed, I'll see the videos and then follow. No, you will simply be blank at that point. So please practice at a regular basis. Please make sure you ask as many as questions as possible. I'm here to answer. I'm here to help you out here as such. Thank you and have a good day ahead. Thanks, guys.